let's talk about the trip overall. What's your assessment of what this has meant? What are the hits? What are the misses? What are even some errors?
I'd say the Middle East, the front half of the trip, not bad. The only thing I'd probably disagree with is the president gave the Arab governments too much of a pass on the flaws in their societies, which are generating groups and recruits for groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Also, his strident anti-Iranian rhetoric could put us in positions that we may not necessarily be comfortable going beyond the rhetoric on. But all things being equal, not bad. In part, quite honestly, both Bibi Netanyahu and the leadership of Saudi Arabia were so happy he was not Barack Obama. They were ready to cheer virtually no matter what. So it essentially went off.
So that's the first half of the trip.
Second half, not so good.
Let's go to Brussels and NATO for
this. It would be hard to script a worse beginning. Again, the president he wasn't walking into a difficult situation. Yes, everybody was suspicious, given what he'd said during the campaign and so forth, but it was kind of low-hanging fruit. If he'd simply gone there and reassured and simply said, look, I know we've had some of our differences. It's been in the last 4 months, though, I've come to respect you. We've got a lot of common challenges. I'm there for you and with you. Article 5, the idea of an attack on one is an attack on all, is something I understand and I've internalized. That's all he had to say. This would have been, today's coverage would have been 180 degrees different, and that would have been the right thing to say, not just the politically popular thing to say. And he didn't do it. He persisted in this idea of publicly lecturing them. And the contrast when he told the Arab governments, I'm not here to lecture you, and then he shows up with democratically elected allies and lectures them. These have been historically, for the last three-quarters of our century, our principal partners in the world. It reaffirmed all their doubts about Donald Trump's America, to put it bluntly.
Well, Richard, help me understand that. Perception is important here, and the last week's experience suggests that he's finding it easier to get on with Middle Eastern leaders and harder to get on with European leaders. Why?
It seems that way because he's also not just Middle Eastern leaders, but with authoritarians. Putin, the leadership of Xi Jinping in China, Mr. Erdogan in Turkey, Mr. Duterte in the Philippines. There's a pattern here. I hate to say it, there's a pattern here. I think the Democratic elected leaders are much more difficult for him to deal with. They've got politics in ways the others don't. They've got real restraints. There's also public opinion in those countries is very anti-American, very anti-Trump. They disagree on everything from climate to trade to how to deal with Russia. They don't like a lot of what Donald Trump is doing here domestically. They see him and they literally scratch their heads and go, this is not the United States I thought I knew. And contrary to the Middle East, they loved Barack Obama. They were so comfortable. Look at the difference in the body language with Angela Merkel sitting with Barack Obama and her sitting with Donald Trump. It really is night and day.
Richard, is this the business approach to doing politics, though, and that's why it suits the president to sit down with the Middle Eastern leaders, because they can get things done? He can bring his son-in-law into the conversation. They're used to those kind of conversations. They want to make deals. He knows the person on the other side of the table. If they say yes, it means something. When he meets the European leaders, if they say yes, they've got to go to their electorate, their parliament, and talk to them. Is that the key difference?
That's a different. Also, there's just different biases. The Europeans care about things like climate change, care about things like human rights, but this administration is essentially written off. They're right up against the Russian threat. In the Middle East, it's slightly different. So I think there's differences in style and the political culture, as you suggest, but also there's real policy differences between this president and this leadership.
So let's take us to the G7 now, because you do know these very well.
Sure.
Have you ever seen a G7 that has been this undefined this late in the process? I mean, usually in the G7...
Is that a leading question?
But usually by now we sort of know what they're going to say.
Yeah.
And I, for one, don't know.
Well, it's going to have to be fairly anodyne because, they'll say some things maybe about terrorism, but there's no consensus on trade, no apparent consensus on climate. Look, the G7 was created, as you know, David, decades ago, and the whole idea was to forge relationships and collective action, not just across the Atlantic, but with Japan. That was the big innovation, bringing the Japanese in. But that means there has to be some kind of a political and intellectual basis or consensus. And guess what? There isn't one. So my hunch is you have very low common denominator sorts of agreements. So I think this is really thin. Adding to it is the lack of staff. You don't have anybody there who spent a lot of time at G7s, I would expect. You still don't have a staffed up State Department or Defense Department. The White House has these various concentric circles. Unless I got it wrong, I don't think the Secretary of State is in Italy. I think he's in London today. I might be wrong on that.
He is.
Okay, so what is Jared Kushner, who's probably the leading figure in this administration's foreign policy, has come back home. It's tough enough to make foreign policy when it's tightly choreographed. This is anything but.